Well, thank you. It is great to be back here at the Academy, and a huge thanks to the New York Academy and the Neuro Foundation for making this series possible. And we are delighted to be kicking off our new series, The Will to Meaning, Seeking the Why of Our Existence. Now, when I first told my wife that this evening we'd be talking about the nature of meaning, she had an interesting response. She thought this was a really dumb idea. She said meaning is a shoddy, fatuous word used by sloppy thinkers that is so flabby it really doesn't mean anything at all. And then she said, well, I hope you're not going to be asking that question, what is the meaning of life? Which she says is truly the most ridiculous question of all. To which I replied, well, you have just dismissed a large piece of what I've been working on for the last decade. So then we had a rather lively and playful argument over a bottle of wine for the rest of the evening. Now, I don't know what kinds of questions that you have with your spouse, but this is actually one of our marital quarrels that pops up every so often, whether it is worth trying to unpack words like meaning and purpose. Is there anything to be learned in the deeper cosmic sense by asking the question, why? Or is the search for meaning a private matter to be figured out on a case-by-case basis? And there are other questions as well. Does science have anything to say about these matters? Or, as Stephen Jay Gould once claimed, do these questions about value and meaning fall outside the realm of science? Now, I've already laid my cards on the table. I love talking about this stuff, and it really goes back to my college days when I was obsessed with reading existential writers like Dostoevsky and Camus and Kafka. But my sense is that some of these questions about meaning and happiness and purpose, those questions I think have evolved in recent decades as we've learned more from psychology, from neuroscience, from evolutionary biology. And these are huge questions. And lucky for us, we have a terrific panel to help sort them out. So let me introduce our speakers. Jay Lombard is the Chief Scientific Officer at Genomind and is in private practice as the Clinical Director of Neuroscience at Lifespan Medicine. Previously, he was Chief of Neurology at both Westchester Square Medical Center and Bronx Lebanon Hospital, and was a clinical assistant professor at New York Presbyterian Hospital and Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He's published in medical textbooks, peer-reviewed papers, and medical journals. His nonfiction books include The Brain Wellness Plan, and his new book is The Mind of God, which explores the relationship between neuroscience and faith. Massimo Pigliucci is a professor of philosophy at the City University of New York, Lehman College. His research is concerned with the philosophy of science, the relationship between science and philosophy, and the relationship between science and religion. He received a doctorate in genetics from the University of Ferrara in Italy, a PhD in botany from the University of Connecticut, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Tennessee. He writes the Rationally Speaking blog and has authored the popular science book Denying Evolution, and his latest book is How to Be a Stoic Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life. Michael Ruse is director of the History and Philosophy of Science program at Florida State University. Before coming to Florida State in 2000, he taught at the University of Guelph for 35 years, and before that, he received his PhD from the University of Bristol. He's a philosopher of science who specializes in the philosophy of biology and the relationship between science and religion, the creation-evolution controversy, and the demarcation problem within science. He founded the journal Biology and Philosophy and has published numerous books and articles, and his latest books are On Faith and Science, co-authored with Edward Larson, and On Purpose. Emily Esfahani Smith is an instructor in positive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a columnist for The New Criterion, as well as an editor at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, where she manages the Ben Franklin Circles Project, working to build meaning in local communities. Born in Zurich, Switzerland, she grew up in Montreal, and she has a master's degree in applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. And she's written for The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and she is the author of the recent book, The Power of Meaning, Finding Fulfillment in a World Obsessed with Happiness. So welcome, all of you. So just a brief word about our format. We will be talking for close to an hour, hopefully having a lively conversation, and we'll open it up to questions. And we're going to have fun tonight. So Emily, let me start with you. Meaning is a word that has a long history, has a lot of baggage. What does this word mean to you?
Right, well, it's like your wife says, it kind of sounds fatuous and vague. So we use the word meaning in everyday language in two senses. The first sense is it really means a lot to me that all of you are here. In other words, meaning in that sense is about kind of the value of something or the worth of something. In the second sense, it has more to do with kind of coherence and understanding. So the meaning of bon appetit is, enjoy this meal or, have a good meal. And if you're talking about a meaningful life, I think both of those senses apply. So when people tell psychologists that their lives are meaningful, it's because they believe that their lives have purpose and worth or significance, and that they believe that their lives are coherent, which means that they understand who they are, they understand where they came from, why they are the way that they are, and they kind of have this narrative that helps them explain their identity. So I think significance and coherence are kind of the two pillars of meaning. And in both psychology and philosophy, you see a lot of thinkers say things like a meaningful life is defined by connecting and contributing to something beyond yourself. So there's something kind of bigger than you that you're working towards contributing to that helps give your life that sense of significance and coherence.
So Massimo, let me bring you into this conversation to have a bit of historical perspective. Is that kind of definition that Emily just laid out? If you go back on the history of philosophy, is that what people have agreed on over the centuries?
To some extent, although there's a large variety of opinions, but I actually would like to start by giving you two answers to the question that your wife doesn't want to have an answer to. What is the meaning of life? The two answers that come to mind are one from a Gary Larson cartoon many years ago. It has one of these evolutionary progressions that no evolutionary biologist actually believes in. It starts with an amoeba, and then there is a fish, and then there is a reptile, and then all this, and then at the end there is the human being, right? Each one of these animals and creatures has the little balloon over their head, and the first one says, eat, sleep, reproduce. The second one says, eat, sleep, reproduce. The third one says, eat, sleep, reproduce. You go all the way to the end, and the human one says, what is the meaning of life? That's the biological answer. Eat, sleep, reproduce. That's what you want to do. But I do think that a better answer actually comes from Garrison Keillor, who used to end, I think, his show, The Very Young Companion, by saying, be good, do good, and keep in touch. Which means that it locates the meaning locally. It's a human construct. It doesn't apply to anything else, as far as we can tell. And it has to do with society. It has to do with interactions with other people. Be good, do good, and keep in touch, all three of them.
So your message is listen to public radio people.
That's right.
Forget about the history of philosophy.
Correct.
Here.
And occasionally indulge in Gary Larson cartoons, yes. But in terms of from a historical perspective, yes, philosophers have in fact dealt quite a bit with questions of meaning all the way back to Socrates and possibly the pre-Socratics. But they have come up with very different answers. The Greek Romans had a certain set of answers. The Christians during the Middle Ages had, of course, a very, very different kind of answer. And then you come to modern existentialism, which says that there is no answer. It's just you smoke a cigarette and have a good time
and look cool.
And then look cool. That's right. And then you're going to die. So the history is complicated. It would take probably the rest of the evening to just go through it. But let us just say that yes, there is a lot of opinions, and they are completely at odds with each other. So you can pick and choose whatever resonates best with you, and you're fine. You can find the philosopher that will back you up.
Okay, so I'm gonna turn to our other philosopher on the panel, Michael. I'm sure you're going to have things to say about meaning, but I want to put another word on the table here because you have just written a book about it, purpose, which has its own complicated history, right?
Well, Steve, I'm still in a state of shock about your personal life. I don't know what kind of relationship you and your wife have, that you sit there and look across the table and talk about meaning in this sort of way. My wife is sitting there. We've been married for 30 years. I don't think we've ever had that kind of conversation. I'm sure that if I said, Lizzie, let's talk about meaning, I'm sure she'd say, well, yes, dear, but would you mind walking the dogs first?
By the way, just one little addendum here. Right before this, I mentioned to my wife, and I said, I'm going to say a few. She knew I was going to say, and she says, I give you permission. And I said, I'm going to make this sort of the entree to our discussion. And she said, oh, my God.
Yeah, your wife and my wife have a lot in common. But seriously, and getting into purpose, I don't think that my wife and your wife are quite as unphilosophical as we're rather making them out to be. Because I worry about people like Emily who are looking for meaning.
Meaning with a capital M.
And I got a feeling that meaning is something, a purpose is, and I'm using these interchangeably, is something which emerges from the lived life. I don't mean that there aren't times when you just have to sit down and say, am I doing the right thing? We were talking about Massimo just before, and he changed from doing biology and took a PhD in philosophy. Now, obviously, that required conscious thought about what you're going to do and is this the most meaningful thing? But at another level, I know him well enough to know he's not spending his time worrying about meaning. He's getting on with it. And at some level, I think meaning and purpose are things which emerge from the fully lived life. And one more jab, not just at you. I see that the meaningful or the purposeful life has to be one which does involve others. I mean, I always say to my students, the truly happy person is the person who's giving to others. But at the same time, I'm enough of a philosopher to listen to the Greeks who say the intellectual life is the supreme at some level. And I'm not sure that that's giving to others. I think that when Mozart was writing his incandescent operas, he wasn't thinking about Michael Ruse, how much pleasure. Oh, Bellini, we're going to Norma tomorrow. And I don't think Bellini was thinking about the pleasure he was giving me. I think Bellini was saying, I've got this aria I've got to do, and it's going to be a hell of a lot better than Donizetti's. I don't see that as either bad or lack of purpose or lack of meaning. So I want to integrate meaning, purpose with others, but also with self.
So one of the questions that's on the table is, do we need to worry about meaning? Or is it just something that happens? I mean, do we need to be having this conversation that we're having right now? Jay, do you want to jump in here?
So first, I think what Emily said is extremely profound and worth echoing from a neurobiological, since I talk mainly from what I know, which is the brain and neuroscience, because two words that you used are actually very much synonymous with what we know about how the brain functions, and that is that the brain, especially our limbic system brain, which is our emotional brain, primarily functions on this concept of valence, right? So we all are assessing the emotional significance of our experiences. What does this experience have for us or not have for us? And the second aspect of life or meaning is coherence, meaning that does the narrative that one tells himself actually, is it concordant with experience or is it discordant with one's experience? And this concept that we have of a soul, which unfortunately I think has been discarded by psychology, and the word mind, which has been also a substitute for the word soul in psychology, has also been discarded. And I think that the point of a discussion like this, in my opinion, is to ask that question, is there a soul? Do we have minds? And if we have a mind, what is our mind? And how do minds actually achieve a state of meaning, which is valence and coherence?
Okay, so let me turn that back to you. Do we have a soul?
100%. Nah.
100%. Define your terms.
There's
what is
absolutely
the soul?
no doubt that we have a soul.
What is it?
And I find it just so, I hate to say this, but I find it arrogant that any scientist...
Oh, don't worry. I've been accused of worse.
Okay. Well, good, because it's as a neurologist, one of the explorations that I took into this concept of faith was really personal for myself. And what I realized is that I know a lot about the brain, and yet I know almost nothing about the brain. And that's a very humbling place to be. So when people say that there's nothing, the soul doesn't exist, I think we really need to roll up our sleeves and talk about, first of all, how we define the soul, what terms are we using, and is there a biological framework that we can actually rest upon to assess not the essence of a soul, but how the soul behaves within the material body.
But you've mentioned the term now several times, and I don't know what you're talking about. So can you define it?
Sure. I'll do my best to define it to you. Let me start with the fact that it's anatomically, we are able to localize to a certain extent, because neurologists love to localize things, right? We want to find out where things exist. So the challenge, obviously, is how do you localize something that's immaterial? That's a paradox. You can't find a physical place for something that's non-physical. Souls are, by definition, non-physical. They're phenomenological, right? They're experiential. But we've done a good job looking at imaging studies of the brain where we can actually see something called autonoetic consciousness. And for the listeners, what that means is the dialogue that we have with ourselves. Like, am I enjoying this conversation? Does this guy know what he's talking about? What's for dinner tomorrow night? Is it going to rain? Who do I love? Who do I don't like? How much money am I going to make next year? All these things are the conversations we have with ourselves. Well, who are we talking to?
But are you using the word soul as just another word for the self?
Using the word, yes. Okay, so I am using the word soul and self interchangeably, yes. But I think that when I say...
Then it does exist.
Of course it exists, right? But then
why call it soul?
Okay, so let's call it self then.
Okay, great.
So if we don't want to call it soul, we'll call it self.
Perfect.
So what is self then? Is self a material, reduced, quantitative, biological, neurotransmitter firings of experience that create the illusion that there's something that's non-material, or is something non-material real?
Or neither. I mean, the philosopher David Hume, for instance, famously said that whenever he was looking inside himself and looking for a self, he didn't find it. What he found was a bundle of sensations. That is, when you introspect, you say, oh, I'm feeling this, I'm hearing that, I'm thinking that, and so on and so forth. And so one reasonable way to construct an idea of the self is that the self is simply a dynamic way in which we think about what's happening to us, we experience what's happening to us, and we are changed by what happens to us. So it's a dynamic, I wouldn't even call it an entity, it's a dynamic representation of what it is that we do and feel and think.
Who's the feeling? What's feeling?
Nobody.
I want to bring Emily back into the discussion here. So you've just written a book about meaning. We've been talking about the self, the biological roots of some of these questions. And the question is, do we need to kind of do this deep dive into what meaning is based on what some of these people have been saying? And where do you go with that?
I think that we're all here because we acknowledge that we do, and that probably most of the people in this room, and I would certainly think that the people on this panel, given our discussion in the green room, have a certain element of being seekers within us, and that in particular, one of the things that inspired me to write my book was the fact that, for decades now, if you take for hundreds of years, like life has objectively gotten better. So rates of violence are down. People are less likely to, die of starvation and disease. That thousands of people each day are being lifted out of poverty, and yet more people feel hopeless, depressed, alone. The suicide rate has been rising for decades. It reached a 30-year high in the U.S. Just last spring. And when you look at what's driving this, what's driving it, according to the research, is a feeling among people that their lives are not meaningful, that kind of religious grounding, that spiritual grounding that for thousands of years gave people clear answers to both what the meaning of life is and how can I lead a meaningful life, is no longer there for people as the default path to meaning. And so we're left on our own to figure out the answer to this question. And I think that's why we see a lot of people turning to Stoicism as kind of a source of of spiritual fulfillment. It's this non-religious kind of spiritual path. I think it's why we see a lot of people turning to kind of neuroscience and psychology as a answer to this question, another secular answer. And so I think it's essential. I mean, Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, was right that we have this will to meaning, and that if we don't experience our lives as meaningful, we suffer. And whether that means kind of experiencing boredom and angst on a day-to-day basis, or feeling like we need to end our lives. And I think it's pretty clear, according to the research shows, that the only way to find that sense of satisfaction and that sense of grounding is to have things in your life that give it meaning. For a lot of people, those things already exist, and you just have to open your eyes to them, whether it's your family, your job, realizing your talents, as you were saying, Michael, backstage.
Is this sort of a subtle way of debating whether we believe in religion or not? Is that kind of the subtext here of what we're talking about? Because you were just saying, for instance, that people in the material sense are better off than they ever were before, but religion has been receding, and people seem to be having a loss.
You could say that if you live in Madison, Wisconsin. If you live in Tallahassee, Florida, I don't see religion receding at all. I mean, on Sundays, you can't get outside the house because they're pulling into the mega churches or the mini churches and everything like that. Question I want to ask you is, you give me suicide statistics. For instance, do we find that amongst Southern Baptists, suicide is practically unknown, but amongst Unitarians, it's pretty high, and amongst the secular humanists, it's way out of sight? I mean, is that what we're finding?
I haven't seen studies that breaks it down by religion, but to your point about this decline in religion, I mean, it's pretty clear that rates of kind of religious involvement, however you measure it, whether it's religious identification, going to church, how many times a week people pray, any measure that you look at of kind of religiosity in day-to-day life has been decreasing. And
so maybe not where you live, Michael, but
well, I want to see a bit more on these things. And of course, the other thing I want to say is, if avoiding suicide means hating gays, being against abortion, and putting that bloody wall between us and Mexico, then there's something almost to be said for, a little reflection, a young Werther type, and maybe I should end it all, because it seems to me that the cost is, the cost, if it means believing in some of the horrible manifestations of religion that we have in this country. And incidentally, folks, despite my accent, my wife and I became American citizens precisely so we could identify and I could criticize. So it's not just a Brit doing it on you. But I feel very strongly about this. But I am appalled. I am absolutely appalled, for instance, by what Pence did the other day. The most anti-black thing I've seen in a politician. And this is the man who's so religious, he won't have supper with another woman if his wife's not there. Now, there's a cost which not worth paying.
We could go into the direction of politics, but I'm gonna try to take it in a different direction here. So
you're just too nice. Why don't you work? You should work for Fox, and then you'd have a real edge.
But I have a couple of statistics that might interest actually Michael, because I don't know either about statistics. But that would be interesting to find out if different religious groups have different frequencies.
If I can just say real quick, just because I thought of it, I mean, Emil Durkheim in the 19th century studied suicide rates across Europe, and he found that they tend to be higher among Protestants and lower among Catholics and Jews. And the reason wasn't so much like the dogma beliefs, but because Catholics and Jews had stronger sense of community. And that among Protestants, there was kind of the individualism, the drive to go and kind of pursue education, pursue career, led to this alienation. So just as a tangent.
No, that's an interesting point. The statistic the two pieces of statistics that I was going to bring up are a little interesting from a different perspective, but they do speak to what Michael was referring to. The divorce rate is higher among Southern Baptists and lowest among secular humanists. And so is the use of internet porn. Highest among Southern Baptists, lowest among secular humanists. Now, what does that tell you? So it tells you that religion may or may not provide an answer to question of meaning, purpose, et cetera, but sometimes some people don't seem to like that answer, and so they look for other things, like internet porn or like multiple wives. So the idea that religion is in fact the answer or the default answer for issues of meaning, I think it's questionable.
Well, Jay, you have just written a book called The Mind of God, and really the intersection that you were exploring is neurobiology and faith. How do you see this?
Well, I think that we have to separate this stereotype that we have of religion versus the sort of conceptualization of when we say religiosity, because I think we all understand that formalized religions have mostly been ideologically bent on separating people of different faiths and have hurt us more than they've given us the gift of what religion should have given us in its pure form, which in my mind is the recognition that we're more than just physical beings, that there's something beyond just our physicality. And I think that as a neuroscientist, my concern is that when we, if we look at society and the trends both in science and also in technology, where we believe there's such a thing as called artificial intelligence, that completely does not exist, by the way. The whole thing is a giant scam. It really is. There's no such thing as artificial intelligence at all. And I'd be happy to debate any AI people in the room to tell them why.
Siri, do you agree?
That's perfect. That's perfect. That's perfect. But what do I mean by that? Is a couple of issues. One is that I think that we are on a slippery slope to define ourselves purely as biological beings, and that has very profound social implications. As Emily brought up, I think that even if we ourselves think of ourselves as being only biological, and there's no value beyond our physicality, then the rates of nihilism go up not only personally, but actually sociologically as well. A Korean missile goes off, we only kill 5 million people. It's only 5 million people. I mean, we think about these numbers as if there's not lives behind each person. And I think that's my concern as a pseudo-philosopher, because I'm not a philosopher, I'm a scientist, that we have to be very careful when we talk about these terms about what it means to be human and having a soul. And if we dismiss these outright without really understanding what we're dismissing, and what we're dismissing is the sense the debate is between materialism and is there something other than materialism that characterizes life. And I personally believe that life is not purely material, that there are phenomenological aspects of life that are immaterial. Thought is, we can't quantify thought. We can't quantify emotion. We try, but we can't do it. And when we talk about the self, we don't know even what that self is. We say, well, the self is the interoception of feelings and thoughts. Well, what is feeling? What is thinking?
Well, okay. So I want to make a couple of distinctions here. First of all, I don't think of myself, for instance, as just a biological thing. I think of myself as a biological and especially a social being. As I said earlier, I think that meaning and purpose come out of social interactions with other people, not just from our basic biology. But of course, we're social in part because we're a particular type of biological organism. Right. We're a social primate, species of primate to begin with. And then we invented these all really complicated things that we call culture that basically no other animal has even remotely close to what right. we have. Right. I think that is all fine, and it goes already well beyond basic biology. Right. When I get a little bit nervous and when people talk about non-physical stuff and so on and so forth, now you can say, but isn't that arrogant to say that it doesn't exist? I don't say it doesn't exist. I say, how do you know that it exists? To me, as a scientist, first, and then a philosopher next, is whenever somebody makes an ontological claim, a claim about existence, my basic question is, how do you know? Why do you think that, right? So my position is not that the soul, however you want to define it, doesn't exist, or that the supernatural doesn't exist, or that the incorporeal doesn't exist. My position is simply that we've come up with a pretty good view of how things work, incomplete as it is, and partly ignorant as it is, without invoking any of that. And when you do invoke any of that, then I think the burden of proof is on you to say, well, here's why I think there is something beyond the corporeal, something beyond the social, something beyond, something material. There may or may not be. I just don't see the reason to invoke it. I'm basically using Occam's razor here. cut to the minimum number of entities and minimum number of hypotheses necessary to explain things. You're right that we still don't know a lot about feelings, we don't know a lot about the self, and so on and so forth. But that is what in philosophy is called an argument from ignorance, right? So just because we don't know, that doesn't mean that we're not licensed to just start making up explanations that don't really explain anything. When I went to catechism as a Catholic, for instance, as a young little Catholic, my priest kept explaining to me that things come, things exist because God is loving and because God wanted to do this and that or the other. And then I asked him at one point the question, and how do you know that? And his answer was mystery of faith. I said, no, that's not an answer. That's not an explanation. That's just telling me believe what I say because I said.
I'm going to jump in here because I don't think we're going to resolve the materialism debate this evening. But it's good to put it on the table. I want to throw out another word that we've barely talked about at all, which is happiness. And we've been talking about the pursuit of meaning. A lot of people would say, actually, what they want is to be happy. That is their goal, to be happy. Meaning would be nice, but happiness is really where it's at. Emily, is that a mistake?
I think it is a mistake, and I take my cues here from Viktor Frankl, who I mentioned earlier, the Holocaust survivor. So for those of you who don't know much about Frankl, he 75 years ago, in 1942, he was transported to a Nazi concentration camp, and he worked as a therapist in the camps, and one of the things that he observed and that he ended up writing about in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, is how so many of the people in the camps had kind of given up the will to live, and understandably so. They had lost everything. They had lost their identities. They had lost their loved ones. All these things that make our lives worth living, in their case, were gone. And so many of them gave up on life, but others held on. They still continued to believe that their lives were meaningful. And those that did, he found, ended up being more resilient to suffering, and even, he argued, more apt to survive. And that sounds controversial to some people, but there's actually modern research, studies of longevity, that show that people who have purpose, who have some kind of reason, who think that they have a role to play in society, end up living longer than those who don't. And one of the things that Frankl said, especially in criticizing American culture, was that we are so obsessed with happiness, and we think that happiness, this pursuit of kind of positive feelings and comfort and leisure, will bring us fulfillment. But actually, happiness, he said, can't be pursued. It must ensue from leading a meaningful life. So I do think that the pursuit of happiness is misguided. And I mentioned some of the research earlier about what's predicting this rise of despair. And the researchers specifically looked at whether it was, whether what predicted it was a lack of happiness or a lack of meaning. And it was a lack of meaning. Happiness didn't predict it at all. So I think this existential vacuum that many people are living with, they think that happiness can satisfy it, but it's not happiness, it's actually meaning.
Michael, you want to weigh in on happiness?
Well, yes, I want to say two things. Towards the end, I found myself in great agreement with you, because when I made the joke about Lizzie saying, take the dogs out to walk, it's not the pursuit of happiness in the sense of laying it out like that, but that happiness emerges from having a well-balanced life, from having a family life and sharing your life with animals and these sorts of things. So that's the one thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is, as philosophers, particularly John Stuart Mill pointed out, you've got to be awfully careful with this word happiness. Mm-hmm. I know we philosophers spoil everything by immediately saying it depends what you mean by, but it really does. If happiness is just going out and getting drunk, or, as happens at Tallahassee every other weekend during the fall, getting absolutely blind drunk and watching young black men knock their brains out for our entertainment, if that's happiness, I'm not big on it. On the other hand, surely, as Mill said, there's happiness that surely Mozart got a supreme sense of self-worth, or Emily Dickinson, writing one of her exquisite poems, must have had, at some level, a kick, if you like, real happiness. Now, whether she sat down to write the poem and said, I want to make myself happy this afternoon, I feel pretty blue, my sister was mean to me, and I'm worried about the Civil War, so I'll write a poem. No, but I think that the happiness in the John Stuart Mill sense, emerges. And I certainly heard that coming from you, although, as I say, I'm not against happiness. I think happiness is a good word, but I think we must talk about what we mean. At the same time, one final thing, it's very difficult for folks like me not to condescend to everybody, particularly to sociologists. I'm a philosopher, you know. I mean, it's part of my stock in trade to look down on everybody. But, you know, starting with, no, what am I saying?
Starting with journalists?
I haven't got my $10,000 honorarium yet. Be careful, Ruse, be careful. No, but I mean, happiness is one of these things, as I say, it's got to emerge. And I don't think there's anything wrong with happiness, but I think you should understand what it is and recognize that happiness for one person is not happiness. My daughter's going to a music festival this weekend. I would hate to go to it, but I'm going to Norma. Am I better than she is? Well, yes, but not really, you know. But at another level, not really.
So there's a couple of things that I'd like to add about the happiness issue. One is philosophical, but before we get to the philosophical, one is actually evidence from psychological research. So, I mean, Michael talked about how Mozart or Dickinson would feel. Most of us are not in that kind of situation, but most of us are in the kind of situations that psychologists actually look at in the field. And one classical study was this idea of asking people if they were happy in the moment when they had children or not. People that had children, people that don't have children. It turns out that having children makes you miserable, not happy in the moment. It's like on a you know, your thing buzzes and the psychologist says, "Are you happy now?" And if you happen to have children, the answer is, "Hell no, I'm not." But then you ask the same people, you know, do you find your life meaningful? Do you find, you know, a purpose in what you're doing? And then most of the people who have children say, yeah, of course I do, and that is a big part of it. Right?
I have to say I have a different take because I've heard those surveys of, you know, if you have children, you're less happy than if you don't. Doesn't it depend on how old the children are?
Yeah.
I mean, yes,
Sure.
if they're 5 years old, maybe if they're 15 years old,
Sure.
yeah, maybe your level of happiness is, you know, kind of down there.
Well.
If they're grown, you know, actually, aren't the children then the source of great happiness? Doesn't it? I mean, I've never understood that.
When they're grown, they're gone, so they're certainly not.
That makes you happy, my friend.
Exactly.
Makes you happy.
Good point.
It's called emptiness syndrome. It's wonderful.
It's also called you finish pay for college. I think. But the point I was getting at was the philosophical one, however. So all the way back to ancient Greece, and now in modern positive psychology, people were making a distinction between happiness and what they call eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is, in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, is the life that is worth living. Now, as Michael pointed out, there's more than one reason why, for different people, why a certain life may or may not be worth living. But that's not happiness in the sense of a happy feeling. You can have a life that is worth living, the kind of life that you get to the end of it, and you look back and say, yeah, that was actually pretty well done. You know, that was I'm pretty good about that, with that stuff. That doesn't necessarily correlate with moment-to-moment happiness. Lots of people can be, you know, drunk all the time and feel happy, so to speak. You can hook people to drugs and they feel happy all the time, but then you get to the end of that kind of life, you say, no, wait a minute, what did I do? And what did you do? You didn't do much that had a social dimension or that involved other people. So again, we come back to this thing that for human beings, meaning and purpose come out of interaction, positive interactions with other human beings. I'm not talking, you know, because they're negative interactions. A psychopath, I don't think, has a good...
I mean, isn't another way of putting this, I mean, it's what you were saying earlier, Emily. It's if you're just sort of trying to get all of this meaning or happiness just yourself, without regard to other people, it's probably going to feel a little empty. But if you are incorporating a larger community or larger family, if your sense of self recedes, you're more likely to find that meaning.
Right, and I do want to say something that I think kind of deepens the point that you're making and goes back to something that you said as well, Michael, about a meaningful life as emergent. So psychologists have kind of picked up this distinction that philosophers have been making for thousands of years between eudaimonia, which I kind of understand as meaning, a meaningful life, and happiness or hedonia. And so in one study, they told people to go out and pursue either eudaimonia or meaning, or to go out and pursue happiness or hedonia. And I think what's really interesting about the study is the things that the people chose to do in these different categories, because it showed how they themselves conceived of these two different terms. So the people in the happiness group did things like sleep in, they played games, they ate sweets, they did things that kind of brought them pleasure and positive feelings in the moment. And the people in the meaning group did things like study extra hard for a test, visit a relative in the hospital who was sick, cheer up a friend, things that were more difficult and effortful, but that engage with their community or with their talents to kind of be better, become their best selves. So the first point is that people conceive of these two things as different, and that they behave differently when they're pursuing one versus the other.
Are you suggesting
Yeah.
there's actually an inverse relationship, that sometimes if you are less happy, you are likely to feel more meaning?
I don't know if the causality works in that direction, but I do think that when you're doing things that are meaningful to you, like raising children or working on a radio show that might be difficult, that it can be stressful and it can make you feel bad, but that it leaves you with this kind of deeper sense of satisfaction down the road. So I think meaning has a more complicated, you can have a happy life and a meaningful life at the same time, but you can also have a meaningful life that isn't happy all the time. Whereas with happiness, that's just a feeling, and your life may or may not be meaningful. But that kind of brings me to the second point about this study, which is that when the psychologists followed up with the people 3 months later to see how doing these different things affected their well-being, what they found was that the ones in the meaning condition actually felt this deeper sense of well-being down the road, whereas those in the happiness group, there was no difference to their well-being. So there's something about meaning that kind of lasts, and that really does involve kind of being good and doing good and connecting, or however you put it.
Jay, I want to bring in the neuroscience perspective here. I mean, these words like meaning or happiness, is there kind of a neurobiology explanation for those
100%. So for both. And in terms of pure hedonism, we know that that's biologically driven by various neurochemicals, particularly dopamine, which has a lot of effect on increasing the perceptual emotional balance of an experience. So if everyone would drink a large cup of coffee or take Ritalin before this conference, they probably would think that what I'm talking about would be more interesting than it actually is, because it would raise their dopamine and say, wow, this is really a fascinating topic. And by the way, we actually coerce children in a certain way to focus on information in the educational system. And I think all neurologists are guilty of this to a certain extent, where we are apt to label kids as being ADD, who are just simply bored. And they go to the healthcare provider and they get a medication that increases their dopamine so that they go back to school, and now they attend because the brain has been tricked into thinking that this has more emotional value than the experience actually does. So we do know that things like happiness do have a biological substrate. We also know that our brains, as much as we like to think that we could figure all this out, our brains are purely operating on belief system. Everything that we do is a belief. And I know it's scary to confront that, but the absolute truth is that cognition and belief are synonymous. And there's many examples of how one could point out that connection, but even if you don't believe, you are still believing something. So there's always an affirmation process. And science, quite frankly, is the idea of actually confirming something that is definitive. And we know that we've sort of taken away sort of the ability of science to objectify things. We know that science can never fully objectify experience. And most scientists who really understand science realize that science is subjective. It's reality by consensus, which is good, because then you have consensual behavior. But we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that what we believe or what we don't believe we can validate through science, because we can't.
But wait a minute. There are some things. I mean, to some extent, I'm with you, but only up to a point. Certainly, there are certain things that are objectively demonstrable, scientifically repeatable, and so on and so forth. Like, for instance, most of us, I assume, tonight we'll leave this auditorium using the elevator, not jumping off the window. And that's because we accept the existence of gravity and that it works in a certain way, right? So that's objective. That's got nothing to do with my belief or not belief. If I don't believe it, I can jump off the window and then I'm going to splash at the bottom of the building. So some things are certainly can be objectified, as you say. When it comes to first-person experience, then I agree with you, that for sure. So the experience that I'm having in this particular moment of these audience, of you guys, and of talking and so on and so forth, that is my own experience, and nobody else can ever get into my mind and have the same exact experience. The science can do certain things with that experience. You can do a brain scan in this moment, and you can show which areas of my brain are lighting up and which one not. You can take my pulse, my pressure, and so on. You can come up with a number of quantitative measures of what's happening to my body, but certainly my first-person experience remains my first-person experience. Right. The only caveat on that is that I worry when people say, no, you didn't say, but there are some philosophers even, like Thomas Nagel, for instance, Michael, who say, well, see, your first-person experience is yours and nobody else can get into it. It cannot be put into a third-person description. Therefore, that's a limitation of science. That's a failure of science. And I look at that and say, bah. What people like that are doing is what in philosophy is called a category mistake.
Right.
Right? A category mistake is when you try to apply a category or a description to something that actually doesn't bear it. So if I were to say, I were to ask you guys, what is the color of triangles? You might think for a second that I'm being deep here. It's like, wow, what does he mean by that? But no, I'm just making a categorical mistake because triangles are not characterized by colors. They're characterized by angles and by sides, but not colors, right? So when somebody says, well, science is limited or it fails because it does not objectify first-person experience, I think they're making a categorical mistake. Science is simply not in the business of doing that sort of stuff.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Oh, hey, we agree. I think we should quit.
We've been talking to some degree at a fairly abstract level about these questions of meaning and happiness and fulfillment, and I'm wondering if there are some practical takeaways for us, for our audience, and I want to go around the panel and ask each of you individually. I mean, you've all been studying these issues in one way or another. I mean, through your scholarship, through your science, and I'm wondering if this hits home for you personally. I mean, if you have changed anything in your own life, in your search for meaning or your search for well-being because of what you've learned. Michael?
It's a good question. I think not, but I think I was very fortunate. When I was in my 20s, I went to graduate school, and it was the 60s when there were lots of jobs for philosophers, for professors, as there aren't now. And I slid into becoming a professor. And I was very lucky because it was made for me. I had colleagues who retired after 35 years or 30 years who basically weren't that happy. Some of them were very conscientious, but they, basically, it wasn't the right fit at some level. They didn't feel as I do going in front of an audience like a vampire in front of a virgin. I want to suck blood out of all of you, starting with you, dear. I am so lucky in that respect. So you ask me, it sounds almost arrogant. Well, it does sound, but it's very fortunate. I am so lucky to have done what I do through my life. I don't refer to, although I'm a philosopher of science, I don't regret not being a scientist. For me, the thrill of finding an idea or something like this, and certainly passing it on to young people, and the joy of young minds like this. I'm very bullish on them, very bullish. So the answer to your question is, I'm not sure that I would have done.
So what you're saying is that this notion of struggle, that you're trying to find more meaning in your life, that's kind of irrelevant to you. The way your life has turned out, it's turned out pretty well.
It certainly has never been a struggle for me about being a philosopher or being a college prof. It has always been tremendously meaningful for me. One other thing, I am so glad that I came to North America. I spent most of my time in Canada because at some level I was able to get away from the wretched class system in England. And that for me was really like Christian at the cross. Suddenly, as I got to the cross, it didn't mean to say I didn't have a long way still to go, but I didn't have that one on my back.
Emily, how does this affect you personally, these questions?
So I do think, perhaps unlike you, that I do kind of feel that I am searching, have always, since really as long as I can remember, have felt that. I grew up in kind of a spiritual household. My parents were Sufis. We lived in a Sufi meeting house, so people were coming to our home to meditate. And we eventually moved out, and when we did, and that daily grounding of Sufism and spirituality weren't there, I began to wonder, what is this all about? Can you lead a meaningful life outside of a religious and spiritual system? And I think writing, doing this research for my book, writing my book, which involved, digging into philosophy and psychology, which we've talked about, but also interviewing people around the world, around the country about their own stories, has taught me a number of things. One of them is that, I think we tend to think that this search for meaning is this difficult quest, that you have to kind of travel to the mountaintop, find your one capital P purpose, your one capital M meaning, and once you do, then you'll be set. But that actually meaning emerges, as Michael was saying, and it emerges, I found in my research, and I would argue, from 4 specific dimensions of life, at least 4. I mean, these are the 4 that kind of came to me in my research. One was belonging, so having relationships where you feel at home, communities where you feel at home. 2 is purpose, having something worthwhile to do. 3 is storytelling, so this narrative that we talked about your life, how you understand the world. And then finally, transcendence, so this idea that there's something more beyond just the physical that you can connect to, and that kind of endows your life with meaning. So those 4 things, after I realized that, are things that I work to build in my life, and I work to find. I think they all exist in all of our lives, so it's a matter of not just building them, but opening our eyes to the fact that they're there.
Okay, Massimo?
My answer is going to be no and yes, meaning that for the first part of my life, I was actually just as lucky or comparably lucky to Michael. I wanted to be a scientist since I was like a little kid. I was lucky enough that I could pursue that career. It just fit right in, and it was very meaningful for several decades. I think that that's not something just that happens to academics. In this particular case, we have 2 academics that have gone through that experience. But if you're a musician, if you're an artist, if you're a writer, if you do a lot of other things, you probably want to do that from very early on in your life. And if you are lucky enough that you get to do them, you feel like that's it. You don't really need any. You don't ask yourself big questions about meaning and purpose because you already have meaning and purpose. But then midlife crisis hit. Right, and so I had to decide: do I buy a Lamborghini or do I study philosophy? And study philosophy was cheaper, so that's the way I went. And once you start studying philosophy, I studied philosophy because I had a great high school teacher in Italy, in Rome, that taught philosophy as a living, breathing subject. Once I started studying philosophy, the first course that I took in graduate school was on Plato, and the second was on ethics, even though my interest is in philosophy of science. And once you start doing that, it's inevitable that you start asking yourself, really, what is it all about, and what am I doing here, and so on and so forth. That got me onto a path that lasted a number of years until I discovered, completely by chance, Stoicism.
And so why do the Stoics resonate so much for you?
It happened on Twitter. Of all places. I saw this thing one day, several years ago, that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I said, what the hell is Stoic Week, and why would anybody want to celebrate it? And I looked into it, and it turns out to be a yearly project by a group of philosophers and psychologists and psychotherapists, cognitive behavioral therapists, who are interested in the Greek-Roman philosophy, updating it to the 21st century and see how it can contribute to meaningful life. And basically what it is, it's actually coming up. Stoic Week is next week, as it turns out, in a couple of weeks. And you sign up, you download a handbook, and you start doing meditations and reading exercises and things like that. And I did it for a week. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Let me do it for another couple of months. And then I did it for another couple of months, and I said, that's really interesting. Let me do it for another year. And now here we are.
So can you just get, I know you've written a whole book on this, but can you give us the very thumbnail version of what the Stoic philosophy is?
Yes, I'll try. The thumbnail version is that there are two fundamental issues. The chief good in life for a Stoic is to be a moral person, to be a good person. And the way you do that is by practicing constantly 4 fundamental virtues, which are practical wisdom, the ability to navigate complex situations in the most effective way, courage, meaning not just physical, but also moral, especially moral courage, justice, a sense of treating other people as human beings the way in which you want to be treated, and then temperance, so doing things in the right measure, not too much, not too little. If you practice this on a day-to-day basis, the idea is you gradually become a better person, you're more integrated with society, you have more meaning out of your life. That's the first idea. The second idea, crucial idea, is what Stoics call the dichotomy of control. Certain things are under your control and other things are not under your control. The things under your control are your opinions, your judgments, your values, the things that you can reflect on and change over time through reflection and practice. Everything else pretty much is outside of your control. So whether I get promoted at my job or not, whether I find a job or not, whether some nutcase is going to push a button and start World War III or not, that's outside of my control. So the idea then is once you realize and you internalize that, you focus more and more your energy on what is under your control. And the rest you start treating it as, well, it's there and I'll deal with it in the best way I can. But it isn't going to affect my happiness in the sense of eudaimonia. It's not going to affect the way in which I look at my life and what I find meaningful in my life.
Okay, Jay, let me turn to you. These questions that we've been talking about, have you changed anything in your own life because of things that you've learned?
Absolutely. And first of all, I think, being a physician, you're lucky because, for many of us doctors, it's a calling, and you're able to, be in situations where people are very dependent on, your professionalism to help usher them into a better physical place than they were before they saw you. So every day is a purposeful day as a physician when you understand your role being like that. So it's not hard to find purpose as a physician. But what I found through writing my book is that I'm now spending time educating other doctors on essentially making sure that question, the question that we're asking here right now about does life have purpose, what is the meaning, to make that a question that physicians ask patients, because we do know from work like Viktor Frankl that survival rates for all sorts of diseases are affected by one's existential state, whether they feel they have purpose or not have purpose. To the point where I just gave a talk with Mark Hyman, who's a very big, well-renowned integrative medicine doctor, suggesting that should be really our 5th vital sign, that when we see patients, no matter what their condition may be, we take their temperature, their pulse, their blood pressure, and ask them, does your life have purpose? And if we find that patients don't have purpose, either we have to help them to rediscover it in whatever way they discover it for themselves, or understand the consequences that we give the best medications in the world for them, and we're not going to be able to undo the profound effects of existential nihilism, not just globally, but actually in each individual level as well. So for me, writing the book and the process of asking the question for myself, does life have purpose? First of all, the answer is yes. I don't think it's debatable that life has purpose, because life and purpose are synonymous. You can't have purpose without life. I mean, whether semantics or not, biology is purpose. If you think about what biology is, all the things about connectivity, about growth, about emergence, these processes are all about relationship between self and other, whether it's self and other or biological self and other. So I think that we shouldn't get too bogged down on trying to define if purpose exists, because purpose 100% exists. Life is purpose. I think we should get bogged down on defining what that purpose is for each person individually, and understand the impact that has if we don't answer that question for ourselves. That helps not only to achieve life satisfaction, but really truthfully for happiness as well.
Okay, we have put out a lot of ideas here, a lot of questions still to be wrestled with. It is time to turn to our audience and your questions. And
So one of the so as Massimo was kind of talking about in philosophy, this distinction between meaning or eudaimonia and hedonia or happiness has kind of for thousands of years been part of the discussion. And in recent years, it's been picked up by psychologists who are trying to study it empirically. And so they've created kind of scales and measures that, these are imperfect tools, but to the best of their ability, these academics are trying to measure these things and determine how, pursuing one versus pursuing the other affects our well-being, affects our, physical states. And they define happiness as a state of comfort and ease, kind of feeling good in the moment. And, Michael was saying that when we talk about happiness, we really need to be clear that we're defining our terms. And, there are a lot of different ways that you can define happiness. You can define it as meaning. A happy life is a meaningful life. But I think that in the popular culture, when you think about what happiness is, when you look at magazine articles about happiness, it's that yellow smiley face, and it's what psychologists are really defining as that kind of positive state. Meaning they define as something bigger. So if your life is meaningful in these surveys, it's because you believe that your life has a sense of significance and worth. So you feel like you're contributing to something beyond yourself. You feel like your life is driven by a sense of purpose or some goal that you value. And then finally, you believe your life is coherent. So that's kind of the distinction. I hope I answered your question.
No, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I have to say, as somebody who has been waiting for the SETI program to produce something since I was born, basically, I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon. But let's assume that it will. So let's say that we do encounter another civilization, another life form, intelligent life form, capable of communication. Very likely their philosophy, their religion, if they have one, their science is going to be very different. And I'm not sure that we'll be able to even communicate meaningfully with them. The idea that meaning is universal, I think, is questionable. Meaning is personal, is social, is species-specific in this case. As far as we can tell, we are the only species on Earth that actually has these kinds of gatherings and thinks about this kind of stuff, right? If there is a Martian who does that, they'll probably do it in a very different way, which will be affected by their evolutionary history, their biology, their neuroscience, their neurobiology, their philosophy, their religion, so on and so forth. So we may be able to learn something interesting from them, but I doubt that they're going to give us answers.
I'm going to interject here because I'm much more of a Kantian on this. I'm inclined to think that there are certain constraints which, if you're going to have anything resembling intelligence, you're going to have, like some notion of causality, and if you've got social animals, some notion of reciprocity. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be understanding the categorical imperative, and I'm not saying it's going to be easy to talk to them, but I've got a feeling if in any sense we think of it as intelligence, there's going to have to be some similarities somewhere. That said, I'm not at all sanguine that we're going to find through the universe superbrains popping out, because my feeling is we're a very unstable species. We're very clever, we've gone a long way, but anybody who thinks in this day and age we're going to last another 20,000 years without bombing the hell out of ourselves? I mean, if North Korea can do it one time and America puts somebody like Trump in charge, we got another 20,000 years to go or more. I really, truly think that intelligent life is at some level unstable, which of course is a good Darwinian position that, you don't expect it to work all the time. So I'm not at all sure that there's those mega brains out there waiting to put us right.
Okay, the voice of pessimism here.
I'll go first, I guess. I think the way I'm understanding your question anyways is how these different kind of status markers or markers of success determine how meaningful our lives are. And when I was researching my book, I talked to a lot of young people, especially young people in kind of high pressure environments who are being told by their parents to aspire to be doctors or to go to graduate school. And it's not just their parents, it's the entire culture that kind of tells them that to live a meaningful life, you have to accrue these external rewards. And what I found is that it creates a real crisis of identity for them as they get older, because they define their identity so much in terms of their success, so that, if I become a doctor, if I get into medical school, if I buy that house, then my life is going well and I have a sense of worth. But then as soon as they start to fail, as we all do inevitably, then there's a real existential crisis, because that thing in my life that gave me so much value is no longer there. And I don't know if you guys followed the story about the suicides at the Palo Alto High School, where these students in this pressure cooker environment, they started kind of killing themselves because they weren't succeeding in the way that they thought they should, and they thought that they decided that their lives weren't worth living because of that. So I would be really hesitant to kind of bundle external rewards with meaning, and would encourage people to think of a meaningful life as the kind of life where you do good things for others in your local community, regardless of what rewards come your way.
I'd like to give you the Stoic answer to that question, which is actually very similar to what you just heard, but it's even more sort of direct. The Stoics refer to those externals with a delightfully oxymoronic phrase of preferred indifference. And you say, whoa, wait, if it's preferred, how can it be indifferent? But what they mean by that is that they're preferred, meaning a career, recognition, reputation, honors, money, all that sort of stuff, health, education, all of those things are preferred, meaning that other things being equal, you certainly rather be healthy than sick, or wealthy than poor, and so on and so forth. But they're indifferent, meaning that they by themselves do not define who you are as a moral person. You can be, regardless of the situation you find yourself and life throws yourself in, you can still exercise the full virtues, you can still be courageous, just, temperate, and wise as much as it is possible. And so in that sense, your life does not depend on externals. It's only marginally improved or not by them. But at a core, you can actually live a good life, meaning in the sense of eudaimonia, in the sense of a life worth living under almost any circumstances.
Well, I think that people pursue happiness thinking that that's the answer to the good life. I don't think people pursue anger thinking that's the answer to the good life. So I think it's just, it's what people think that they should be pursuing happiness. And I guess what I'm saying, and what maybe some of the people on this panel are saying, is that happiness is an emotion that's ephemeral. So maybe that shouldn't be what we're pursuing.
But I mean, to put a Buddhist spin on that,
Yeah.
I mean, they certainly do address anger, and would say that often that is something that you have to be able to harness. You have to be able to, sometimes put it at a distance so it doesn't take over your life, and that would be perhaps a condition for being happy.
Right, and go ahead.
No, sorry. So I was going to say, yeah, the Buddhists for sure. But Seneca, for instance, wrote an entire book on anger called. And I checked recently, the APA, the American Psychological Association, has a section on anger management, and 80% of it is basically Seneca, without acknowledging it, unfortunately. So what Seneca said was that anger is a temporary madness, that you don't want to do anything when you're angry, even if your anger is justified, even if it is a righteous anger. You don't want to act on it, because very likely you're gonna regret it. And so he actually tells you very simple things like, are you angry? Okay, great. Go for a walk around the block and come back, or count until 20. And then when you come down, then you assess the situation, more reasonably, more rationally. So anger is definitely a disruptive emotion that does not contribute to happiness or to eudaimonia. I don't think that purpose is relative. I mean, you're right that different people may find purpose and meaning doing things that are diametrically opposed to what other people think is meaningful. But I don't think that anything goes. And I think there are constraints. In that sense, I guess I'm going to use Michael's phrase, although I certainly wouldn't call myself a Kantian. But I do think that there are, notice that how I said it, Kantian. But I certainly think there are constraints. So to begin with, there are biological constraints. There are social constraints, meaning that we are a social species. And a lot of discussions we have in society today is about the right balance between altruism and selfish interest and things like that. But in fact, at bottom, we are a species that dramatically depends, as you know, every individual depends dramatically on the interactions, on positive interactions with other individuals, so that this distinction between selfish interest and altruistic interest is actually artificial. It's a result of certain kinds of ideologies. In reality, we're all here together on the same boat, and we better navigate it together. So I do think that there is a variety of ways to cash out the idea of meaning, and they are, so there's no single answer to the question. There are a variety of meaningful lives. But there is also a variety of lives that appear to be meaningful, but in fact the people that are living those lives are in fact mistaken. I mean, you've given examples that are more difficult to parse because they're complex. There's a lot of variety there. But you know, sorry, but the Nazi life is not a meaningful life. Now the Nazi may disagree, but they're just wrong. And right, so. And if they don't accept it, then we just wage war against them to make them accept it. So I don't think that one can go full relativist on these things. There are certain forms of life that are clearly destructive to human society. They're clearly not, on average, bringing flourishing to individual members of that society. And therefore, I think they're mistaken. And in fact, a lot of the efforts of philosophers since the Greeks and Romans was precisely to try to figure out the best ways to achieve a eudaimonic life and then to teach others that might be under mistaken impressions about it. So I mean, the answer is complicated. There's not a single answer. It's not true that anybody wants to say that is the way to live your life and that anything else is unacceptable, I think is a fool. But the same token, it's simply not the case that anything goes. A lot of things just don't go or shouldn't go, and we should oppose them.
But I think we can bring Kant in again here.
Oh, no.
Because Kant said, you know, there are two things, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. And I hear what you're saying, and I'm very glad you brought up the word value, because that's what we're talking about. What is the valuable life? Now, yeah, there are things that you do on a day-to-day basis which are value. You go to college to get a degree, to earn money, and all of these things. But if we're talking about, you know, the big questions sort of thing, I want to say that I don't want us all to be Mother Teresa's. I think there's got to be a place for Aristotle too. In other words, what I want to say is I think the meaningful, the valuable life is surely one, for me as a teacher, interacting with my students. But it's also been, for me, very much the life of scholarship, which at a certain level, anybody who's a scholar or creative knows that ultimately, this is ultimately totally selfish. You do it for yourself. If you have to do it for yourself. You may say you're doing it for others, and to the granting agency you say you're doing it for others, but that's BS. You're doing it for yourself, and that's okay. So I really want to say that, yeah, meaningful life, but I want to see two poles, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. Kant.
Well, I can give you the Stoic answer to that one, which actually is shared by a number of other philosophies and religions, including Buddhism. I mean, Buddhism has come up a couple of times before. There's a lot of similarities between the two. In fact, I tend to think of Stoicism as the Western equivalent of Buddhism, essentially. So from a Stoic perspective, there is no universal meaning from tragedies like the one you're talking about. There is nothing big that comes out, no progress that comes out of it. What it does is you reflect on them, and you say, okay, those things are inevitable aspects of life. They just happen. And what you derive from it is, therefore, by contrast, a increased appreciation for the fact that there are still people out there that are good, that are trying to do good. You derive increased appreciation for the fact that you are still alive and you can do good to other people, right? So it's a question. I mean, the Stoics in general tend to reflect a lot on death, especially their own death, but not in a sort of morbid fashion. Death is simply a natural process. It happens. Unfortunately, sometimes it happens way before it should happen, probably, because of human action. But it is a part of life. As such, you accept it as a natural part of life. And what you do instead is, that is a way to set it aside. Okay, it's going to happen at some point. It could be today, it could be next year, it could be in 10 years. Seneca says, live your life every day as if it were your last, meaning that you appreciate whatever you have. You wake up in the morning and say, oh God, I got another day. And I can do something useful with that day. And that may take an infinite number of forms, including helping to avoid or forestall tragedies like the one you're talking about. You may or may not succeed, but even the attempt, even the fact that you're trying to do something about it, that is what makes it meaningful.
Yeah, and I think another way to make meaning from these senseless tragedies is to memorialize them. You know, the Civil War is something that we as a country are constantly creating. You know, it's part of our myth. Like the story of America, we have this myth about the Civil War, the role that it played, the fact that these lives weren't lost in vain because this good was produced from that terrible loss. And so what story are you trying to tell? Dan McAdams, a psychologist at Northwestern University, looks at stories and how stories can kind of help people create meaning. And he's found that the most meaningful stories that people tell, in other words, the stories that people tell who rate their lives as the most meaningful, tend to be redemptive stories. So stories that move from bad things happening to good things happening. And there are a lot of classic examples of redemptive stories in our popular culture. You know, the rags to riches story, the civil rights movement is a redemptive story from suffering and bondage to liberation. And so what are the stories that we're telling? Are they redemptive stories? Is that one way that we can make sense of them? I think another way is to maybe broaden our understanding of the kind of meaning that we are making. So maybe there isn't legislative progress made right now, if that's your definition of meaning for this, but maybe there are other ways that meaning is being made so that those people who died did not die in vain. Maybe their stories get shared and inspire others, things like that. So to think of meaning in broader terms than just kind of political progress, maybe. Well, what's interesting is in some of the countries that are the happiest, like the Scandinavian countries, and I think even Bhutan, are countries that have some of the highest rates of suicide, and that some of the countries that are the unhappiest, like countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South America, Central America, poor countries, they tend to have lower rates of happiness, but also lower rates of suicide. So I think that, it raises the question of what it means living in the modern world and how modernity has brought us so many things that have enhanced our happiness, but maybe has left us with that kind of spiritual, a spiritual emptiness. So I guess I wouldn't necessarily conflate happiness and meaning at the societal level either, because we see that they're kind of two distinct ideas that play themselves out separately in cultures. That said, I think that if you look at places that are really kind of trying to instill cultures of meaning, in other words, they're not just concerned about like a profit motive or gross domestic product, but with how each individual can lead a meaningful life. And I studied some of them in my book, from schools to corporations. What they really do is they're trying to build up those four things that I mentioned earlier within their cultures to help the people in them live meaningful lives. So belonging, purpose, storytelling, and transcendence.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there's no life without, I think you put it, there's no life without meaning.
No life without purpose, you said.
Purpose, sorry, without purpose. I would say there is no purpose without life. Oh. The only things that can be purposeful are living things.
Right.
But not all living beings are purposeful. In fact, the majority of living beings are not purposeful. They're just the result of mechanistic processes such as natural selection, mutation, and so on and so forth. Then it comes to complex, intelligent, conscious beings like us, and maybe the aliens that we may or may not meet one of these days. And all of a sudden, the concept of purpose and meaning and eudaimonia and all that sort of stuff comes about. That's because conscious beings are characterized, like us, are characterized by a couple of things. First of all, we're conscious of our mortality, among other things. Right? We have no reason to believe that amoebas are conscious of their mortality. They just are. They just do what they do. But we, on the other hand, reflect on the fact that one of these days our consciousness is going to be gone and we're going to be dead. And that triggers a lot of questions about, well, then what am I doing here? Why am I doing it? And so on and so forth. And then we also have a complex language that allows us to articulate, to produce and articulate a lot of interesting, sometimes false, sometimes true, sometimes neither, thoughts about what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. So I think that meaning is a human, on planet Earth at least, meaning is a human phenomenon. Purpose is a human phenomenon. Everything else just is, and it does what it does.
Any last words? We are almost out of time.
Well, I'm just appalled now at this Cartesian position that my fellow philosopher is taking. I mean, I'm very uncomfortable with saying that my dogs don't at some level have an independent purpose or meaning or something like that. There's an arrogance there that
There's the second time that being called out tonight. You guys owe me at least a bottle of wine
and you're hoping for a third, and then you get the bonus.
Left, so please. Yes. What do you find arrogant? I mean, I'm really puzzled by this thing of arrogance. All I'm saying here is that there's something different about human beings that is not shared by amoebas and things like that.
Yes.
I mean, you know that there are some of our esteemed colleagues, even sat down nearby at NYU, who have embraced something called panpsychism, according to which not only amoebas and dogs have consciousness and all that, but in fact, specks of dust and rocks and things like that. I think that's just crazy. There's no reason to believe that at all. And
well, you're just trivializing panpsychism now, if you don't mind my saying. God, here we go.
Anyway,
you better shut us up quickly.
and something trivial.
Panpsychism, the subject for another panel. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience.